The clay tablet slipped from the scribe's trembling fingers, shattering against the stone floor of the temple archive. What he had just translated, what those ancient cuneiform symbols revealed about the inner sanctum of Babylon's most sacred temple, made him question everything he thought he knew about the priesthood. The document he held wasn't a hymn or a prayer. It was a registry, a catalog of names. Slave women who entered the temple's hidden chambers and were never seen by their families again. But here's what made his blood run cold. Next to each name was a phrase in Old Akkadian that translated roughly to, "given to the hidden purpose." For 2,000 years, that purpose remained buried. Until now. Tonight, I'm going to take you deep into one of history's darkest secrets, a practice so disturbing that even other ancient civilizations who practiced slavery found it unspeakable. This isn't just about Babylon's fall or its hanging gardens. This is about what happened in the shadows of the ziggurats, in chambers where screams were drowned out by hymns, where the most vulnerable women in society faced a fate that historians have only recently begun to piece together. And I need to warn you, this story will challenge everything you think you know about the ancient world. Let me take you back to Babylon, circa 580 BCE. Picture this. The greatest city in the known world, its blue-glazed walls rising like manufactured mountains from the Mesopotamian plain, the Ishtar Gate gleaming with golden lions and dragons that seem to writhe in the desert sun. The Euphrates River cuts through the city's heart like a liquid highway, and along its banks, the gardens of Nebuchadnezzar cascade in impossible green terraces. Merchants from India, Egypt, and the Mediterranean crowd the markets. The smell of frankincense and myrrh mingles with roasting meat and human sweat. This is Babylon at its zenith, the jewel of the ancient world. But every jewel has its flaws, and Babylon's ran deeper than anyone on those bustling streets could imagine. At the city's spiritual center stood the Esagila, the great temple complex dedicated to Marduk, king of the gods. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was a city within a city, an autonomous zone where the priests wielded power that rivaled even the kings. The temple owned vast estates, collected taxes, controlled grain stores, and operated what we might today call a parallel government. And like any government, it had its secrets. Now, let me introduce you to someone. Her name was Lilitu, though that might not have been her real name. In the fragments of temple records that survived Babylon's eventual destruction, names of slave women were often replaced with epithets or generic terms. Lilitu means of the night, and in this case, it probably wasn't a name she was born with. She was perhaps 16 years old, though in that world, such ages were rarely recorded with precision. What we know is that she was a slave, born into bondage, the daughter of a woman who had herself been enslaved when her village was conquered during one of Nebuchadnezzar's endless campaigns. Lilitu had spent her entire life serving in the household of a minor merchant. She had learned to grind grain, weave cloth, carry water from the river. Her hands were calloused, her back strong from labor. She had never known freedom, but she had known something approaching stability. She had friends among the other slaves, moments of laughter stolen between tasks. She had even harbored quiet dreams, impossible as they were. Dreams of somehow earning her freedom, of perhaps marrying another slave and having children who might, in some distant generation, know what it meant to belong to themselves. Then came the day that changed everything. The merchant who owned her had fallen into debt. Serious debt. The kind that threatened not just his business but his life. And in Babylon, there were always ways to settle debts, especially if you had assets to liquidate. Human assets. 3 priests arrived at the merchant's home one morning, their white linen robes spotless despite the dusty streets, their faces impassive behind elaborate beards braided with blue beads. They didn't speak to Lilitu. They barely looked at her. They examined her the way you might examine livestock, checking her teeth, her hair, running hands along her arms to assess her strength. She stood frozen, terrified, as the head priest nodded slowly. Words were exchanged with her owner. A small chest of silver changed hands. And just like that, Lilitu's life as she knew it ended. But here's what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known. She hadn't just been sold. She had been consecrated. The walk to the temple complex should have taken perhaps 20 minutes through Babylon's crowded streets. But to Lilitu it felt like a journey to another world. The priests moved in silence, and she was given no explanation. Other slaves being transferred might be told their new duties, where they would work, what would be expected of them. But the priests offered nothing, just silence and the rhythmic tap of their staffs against the paving stones. When they passed through the temple's outer gates, Lilitu felt the temperature drop. Not literally, though the massive walls did block the sun. It was something else, something that made her skin prickle with instinctive dread. The courtyard was filled with worshippers, merchants offering sacrifices, scribes bent over their tablets. But the priests led her past all of this, through a smaller gate, into a section of the complex she had never even known existed. Can you imagine being in her place? 16 years old, utterly powerless, being led deeper and deeper into a labyrinth of corridors where the sounds of the city faded to nothing, where the only light came from oil lamps that cast shadows that seemed to move with malevolent intent. They descended. That's what the archaeological evidence shows us, what the temple layouts reveal. Beneath the grandeur of Babylon's temples were subterranean levels, chambers carved into the earth itself. These weren't crypts or storage rooms. They were something else entirely. Lilitu was brought to a chamber where 7 other young women waited, all slaves, all wearing the same expression of confused terror. An older woman, also a slave by her markings, stood guard. Her face was a mask of resignation, and when one of the girls tried to ask her a question, she simply shook her head. "Save your voice," she said quietly. "You'll need it later." What did that mean? The question hung in the air like smoke. For 3 days they were kept in that chamber. They were fed well, better than most slaves ever ate. Rich bread and dates, meat and beer. They were bathed in perfumed water, their skin rubbed with oils until it gleamed. Their hair was arranged in elaborate styles. To anyone watching without context, it might have seemed like they were being prepared for something special, perhaps to serve at a royal banquet or to be presented as gifts to foreign dignitaries. But there were other signs, darker signs. The older slave woman who tended them had scars. Not the usual scars of labor, but something else. Marks on her wrists and ankles that suggested restraints, and a look in her eyes that Lilitu would later recognize as the aftermath of unspeakable trauma. And there was something else. Every night, from somewhere deeper in the subterranean complex, they could hear sounds. Chanting, yes, the kind of liturgical hymns you'd expect in a temple. But beneath that, other sounds. Crying, screaming, the desperate pleading of women's voices that would suddenly cut off, leaving a silence more terrifying than the sounds themselves. Now, before we go further, I want you to understand something about the religious structure of Babylon and why what happened in these temples was possible. Take a moment to hit that like button if you're finding this as disturbing and fascinating as I am researching it, because understanding this context is crucial to grasping the full horror of what came next. In Babylonian religion, the gods were not distant, abstract concepts. They were real, present, and demanding. The temples weren't just symbolic structures, but literal houses where the gods dwelt. And the priests weren't merely religious officials. They were the gods' servants, their intermediaries, and in many ways, they were considered extensions of the gods themselves. What a priest did in service to the god was, by definition, holy. This created a theological framework where virtually any action, no matter how cruel or exploitative, could be justified as divine will. The priesthood operated with almost complete autonomy. Yes, they technically served at the pleasure of the king, but in practice, the relationship was symbiotic. The king needed the priests to legitimize his rule, to perform the rituals that ensured the god's favor, to maintain the cosmic order that kept the Euphrates flooding on schedule and the harvests abundant. The priests needed the king's military power to protect their wealth and privileges. It was a mutual protection arrangement, and the victims of this arrangement were always the powerless. Slave women occupied the absolute bottom of Babylon's social hierarchy. They had no legal personhood. They couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court, couldn't refuse any order from their owners. They existed in a category somewhere between human and object, and what happened to them was a matter of complete indifference to the law. If a slave woman disappeared into the temple complex, if she was never seen again, who would complain? Who would investigate? Her owner had been compensated. The priests had acted within their rights. The system worked exactly as designed. On the fourth day, Lilitu and the other women were brought to a larger chamber. This one was different. The walls were covered in cuneiform inscriptions, prayers and incantations in the old language that predated even Babylon. In the center of the room stood an altar, but not the kind used for animal sacrifices. This was something else, a stone platform with channels carved into its surface, channels that led to drains in the floor. The room smelled of incense so thick it made Lilith's head swim, and something else, something metallic and organic that she couldn't quite identify but that filled her with visceral dread. A high priest entered, flanked by 6 others. This man was different from the priests who had purchased Lilitu. He wore not white but deep blue, the color of lapis lazuli, the color of royalty and the heavens. His beard was shot through with gray, his face lined with years of authority. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber with practiced resonance. "You have been chosen," he said, and there was something in the way he said chosen that made it sound like a curse disguised as an honor. "The god Marduk has need of vessels. You will serve a purpose higher than any you could have achieved in your miserable lives. You will be the recipients of divine essence, the bearers of sacred mystery. You should be grateful." One of the girls, younger than Lilitu, perhaps 14, began to cry. The high priest's expression didn't change. He simply nodded to one of his subordinates, who seized the girl by her hair and dragged her forward. What happened next is difficult to describe without crossing lines I don't want to cross on this channel, but I'll tell you what the historical record suggests, what the temple documents euphemistically refer to as the sacred joining or the ritual of divine seed. The priests of Marduk and priests of other Babylonian gods practiced what they called hierogamy, sacred marriage. On the surface, this was a ritual where the high priest would symbolically unite with a priestess representing the goddess Ishtar, a ceremony meant to ensure fertility and cosmic harmony. But in the temple's hidden chambers, hierogamy took on a far darker meaning. Slave women like Lilitu were used in rituals that the priests claimed would channel divine power, rituals that involved systematic assault under the guise of religious ceremony. These weren't marriages, sacred or otherwise. They were organized brutality, rape sanctified by theological justification. The women had no choice, no voice, no escape. They were held down on those stone altars while priests performed acts they claimed would transmit the god's essence. Acts that left the women traumatized, broken, often pregnant. And here's where it gets even worse. This wasn't a one-time ordeal. This was their new existence. Lilitu and the other women were not kept in the temple temporarily. They became permanent residents of the subterranean complex, a hidden population of women who existed solely to serve the priest's desires under the cover of religious ritual. They were kept in cells when not being used, fed enough to keep them alive, and brought out whenever the priests deemed it necessary to perform their so-called sacred rites. Some of the women became pregnant. This was often intentional. In the twisted logic of the temple hierarchy, children born from these unions were considered especially sacred, marked by divine parentage even though everyone knew the fathers were very human priests. These children, if they survived, were sometimes raised as temple servants themselves, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of abuse and exploitation. But many pregnancies ended differently. The archaeological record shows us something chilling. In excavations of Babylonian temple complexes, researchers have found disturbing concentrations of infant remains in certain underground chambers. Not burial chambers or cemeteries, but disposal sites. The tiny bones show evidence of intentional killing, and the locations suggest they were offspring of the temple's hidden population. Babies who were deemed unsuitable or unnecessary, who were eliminated with the same casual efficiency you'd use to dispose of broken pottery. The women who survived years in this hell, women like that older slave who had first tended to Lilitu, carried scars both visible and invisible. Some went mad, their minds breaking under the sustained trauma. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming hollow-eyed automatons who performed their required functions with mechanical compliance. A very few, found ways to resist. There's a fragment of a clay tablet, discovered in the ruins of the Esagila temple, that records what the priests called the incident of the defiled ritual. Reading between the lines of their bureaucratic language, what apparently happened was this. A group of slave women, perhaps 5 or 6, managed to coordinate a desperate act of rebellion. During one of the nighttime rituals, when several priests were present, the women attacked. Imagine the scene. The underground chamber lit by flickering lamps, the air thick with incense, and suddenly women who were supposed to be compliant victims transformed into furies. They used whatever they could: fingernails, teeth, a stolen ceremonial knife. They managed to kill one priest and seriously wound 2 others before they were overwhelmed. The tablet records their punishment with chilling bureaucratic detachment. They were not simply executed. That would have been too merciful, too quick. Instead, they were subjected to what the tablet calls purification through suffering, a process that apparently involved days of torture designed to break them completely before they were finally allowed to die. And the tablet's author notes, with evident satisfaction, that their screams served as a valuable deterrent to other potential troublemakers in the temple's hidden population. But here's something that haunts me. The tablet also notes that the incident required replacement acquisitions and lists an expenditure of silver for purchasing new slave women. In other words, within weeks of this desperate rebellion, the system simply replenished its supply of victims and continued exactly as before. The women who died fighting for some shred of dignity were replaced like broken tools, and the machinery of exploitation ground on. Let me take you back to Lilitu's story. By this point, she had been in the temple complex for perhaps 2 years. 2 years of sustained horror that would have destroyed most people. She had been pregnant 3 times. 2 pregnancies ended in forced terminations when the priests decided the timing was inconvenient. The 3rd resulted in a daughter who lived for perhaps 6 months before succumbing to one of the diseases that ravaged the underground chambers where light and fresh air were luxuries rarely enjoyed. Lilitu held her dying daughter in the darkness, feeling the small body grow cold, and something inside her broke in a different way than the priests intended. Instead of shattering into compliant numbness, she hardened into something sharp and determined. She began to plan. In the hierarchy of the temple's hidden world, there were slave women like Lilitu who were used in rituals, and then there were the older women, the survivors, who managed the day-to-day functions of this underground nightmare, who prepared the younger women, who cleaned the chambers, who disposed of the evidence of what happened there. These older women were broken in their own ways, but they also knew things. They knew the layout of the complex, the schedules of the priests, the moments when the guards grew complacent. Lilitu befriended one of these women, a woman who had been in the temple for more than a decade, whose name we'll never know. She did this carefully over months, offering small kindnesses, sharing food, providing comfort in a place where such things were rare. And gradually, painfully, she learned that this older woman had once tried to escape, had once harbored dreams of freedom, had once been someone other than a broken guardian of hell. The river, the woman whispered to her one night. There's an old drainage channel that leads to the Euphrates. It's been blocked for years, but if you're small enough, desperate enough, can you imagine the courage it took for Lilitu to even consider this? She knew what happened to women who tried to escape. She'd heard the screams, but she also knew that staying meant a slow death of the spirit even if her body continued to breathe. She prepared in secret. She stole small amounts of food, hiding them in her cell. She exercised when she could, keeping her muscles strong despite the poor diet and lack of sunlight. She memorized the guard rotations, noting when the subterranean levels were least supervised. And she waited for the right moment. It came during the festival of Akitu, Babylon's great New Year celebration. The entire city was caught up in the 12-day festival, and even in the temple's dark underbelly, the routine was disrupted. Many of the priests were involved in the public ceremonies, the grand processions through Babylon's streets. The underground chambers were left with minimal supervision. On the 7th night of the festival, when the city above was drunk on beer and religious fervor, when the sounds of celebration filtered even into the depths where Lilitu was kept, she made her move. The old drainage channel was exactly where the older woman had said it would be, hidden behind a loose stone panel in a storage chamber. The opening was small, so small that Lilitu had to exhale completely to squeeze through, the rough stones scraping her skin, her dress tearing. She crawled through absolute darkness, through water that smelled of rot and waste, through spaces so tight that panic threatened to overwhelm her. She had no way of knowing how long the channel was, whether it actually led to the river or if it had been completely blocked somewhere ahead. Whether she would get stuck and die slowly in the darkness, her body never found. She just crawled forward because going back meant certain recapture and a fate worse than drowning. The channel seemed to go on forever. Her hands were bleeding, her knees bruised and raw. She could hear water somewhere ahead, a sound that could mean the Euphrates or could mean she was about to drown in a flooded section of the tunnel. She kept crawling. And then, impossibly, she felt cooler air, smelled something other than stone and filth. The channel opened up slightly, and she could see, far ahead, the faintest glimmer of moonlight on water. She emerged from the drainage outlet into the Euphrates like something being born, gasping, sobbing, alive in a way she hadn't been for 2 years. The river current caught her immediately, pulling her away from the temple complex, away from the walls of Babylon. She didn't fight it. She let the water carry her, keeping just her head above the surface, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the nightmare she'd escaped. Miles downstream, as the sun began to rise, Lilitu dragged herself onto the bank. She was free, technically, but what did freedom mean for a slave woman in ancient Mesopotamia with no papers, no protector, no legal identity? She was in constant danger of recapture, of being enslaved again by anyone who came across her. But here's the thing that makes Lilitu's story different, the twist that historians piece together from fragments of evidence. She didn't just run, she decided to speak. There was a practice in ancient Babylon where someone with a grievance could approach the king during certain public audiences, could petition directly for justice. It was rarely successful, especially for slaves, but it was technically allowed. And Lilitu, who had survived 2 years of hell, who had crawled through darkness to reach the light, decided she had nothing left to lose. During one of Nebuchadnezzar's public audiences, as the great king sat in judgment in his palace courtyard, a skeletal figure in rags pushed through the crowd. Before the guards could seize her, she threw herself at the king's feet and began to speak. She told him everything, not in the euphemistic language of official records, but in raw, brutal detail. She described the chambers beneath the Esagila, the rituals, the babies disposed of like trash, the women kept as perpetual victims in the name of the gods. She named priests, described specific incidents, offered details that only someone who had lived through it could know. The courtyard fell silent. This wasn't supposed to happen. Temple business was supposed to remain temple business. The king and the priests had their arrangement. But Lilitu's testimony, delivered with desperate eloquence before hundreds of witnesses, had created a political crisis. Nebuchadnezzar was trapped. If he dismissed her claims, he risked appearing to condone the priest's behavior, risked alienating the common people who were listening with increasing horror. But if he investigated, he risked conflict with the temple, risked undermining the religious authority that helped legitimize his rule. So he did what powerful rulers often do when confronted with uncomfortable truths. He ordered an investigation that was designed to fail. A commission was appointed, led by a senior priest from a rival temple and several nobles with ties to the Esagila. They conducted interviews, reviewed documents, inspected the temple complex. And they concluded, surprise, surprise, that Lilitu was either delusional or malicious, that no evidence supported her claims, that the priests had done nothing wrong. Lilitu was declared a liar and a troublemaker. She was returned to slavery, though not to the temple. Even the commission recognized that would look bad. She was sold to a brick maker, spent the rest of her life in hard labor under the Babylonian sun. But something had changed. Lilitu's testimony, even though officially discredited, had spread throughout Babylon. People talked, they whispered, they looked at the great temple complex with new suspicion. Some families refused to allow their slave women to be sold to the temples. Some junior priests, disgusted by what they'd learned, left the priesthood. The practices Lilitu had described probably continued in some form, because institutions that powerful don't reform themselves easily. But they became more cautious, more secretive, more aware that their actions might someday be exposed. And here, in our own time, as archaeologists uncover more evidence, as historians translate more tablets, as we piece together the reality of life in ancient Babylon, Lilitu's testimony is being vindicated. The infant remains found in temple complexes, the evidence of underground chambers designed for purposes that had nothing to do with public worship, the records of slave women purchased by temples in numbers far exceeding any legitimate religious need, the fragments of texts that describe rituals in language that makes modern readers' skin crawl, all of it supports what Lilitu tried to tell the world more than 2,000 years ago. There's something profoundly important about Lilitu's story, something that extends far beyond ancient Babylon. Throughout history, those in power have used sacred authority to justify exploitation. They've used theological language to sanctify abuse. They've used institutional structures to protect perpetrators and silence victims. And throughout history, the courage of individuals like Lilitu, who risk everything to speak truth to power, has been the only real check on these systems. The Babylonian priests who ran these underground chambers believed they would never be held accountable, that their actions would be forgotten or justified by theological necessity. They believed the slave women they victimized were too powerless, too invisible, too thoroughly dehumanized to ever matter to history. They were wrong. We remember them now. We speak their names, or at least we speak the generic epithets like Lilitu that replaced their real names. We honor their suffering by refusing to let it be forgotten or dismissed. And we recognize in their stories a pattern that echoes through every era, that those who invoke divine authority to harm the vulnerable are not holy. They are simply predators who have found effective camouflage. Babylon fell. The great city with its hanging gardens and glazed walls was conquered, burned, abandoned. The Esagila temple, where priests once wielded unchecked power, crumbled into ruins that archaeologists would sift through millennia later. The entire civilization disappeared, became the stuff of legend and biblical prophecy. But the pattern didn't end with Babylon. It repeated itself in Rome, in medieval Europe, in every society where religious authority was combined with unchecked power and where certain categories of people were deemed less than human. It continues today wherever institutions protect themselves at the expense of victims, wherever power structures prioritize their own preservation over justice. What happened to slave women in Babylonian temples wasn't punishment, as the title of this story suggests. Punishment implies transgression, implies that the victims had done something to deserve their fate. These women were guilty of nothing except existing in a world where their powerlessness made them vulnerable to those who claimed to speak for the gods. What happened to them was something worse than punishment. It was systematic dehumanization, sustained exploitation, the reduction of human beings to objects for others' use. It was possible not because the priests were uniquely evil, though they certainly were evil, but because the society around them had created structures that made such evil not just possible but sustainable, not just tolerated but protected. And here's the question I want to leave you with. How many modern structures operate on the same principle? How many institutions today prioritize their own authority over the dignity of the vulnerable? How many systems exist that make certain categories of people invisible, unheard, disposable? Lilitu crawled through darkness to reach the light. She spoke truth despite knowing it would cost her everything. Her testimony was officially dismissed, but it survived in the whispers of common people, in the suspicions of those who knew something was wrong, and eventually in the archaeological record that proves she was telling the truth all along. We owe it to her, and to all those whose names we'll never know, to listen when victims speak, to believe them even when institutions insist we shouldn't, to remember that silence always protects perpetrators, never victims. The slaves women of Babylon's temples have been dead for over 2 millennia, but their story is not over. Not while we remember them, not while we recognize the patterns that led to their suffering, not while we commit ourselves to building a world where such horrors become genuinely impossible rather than merely hidden. If this story affected you, if it made you think, if it disturbed you as much as it should, share it. Drop a comment telling me what aspect of this history struck you most powerfully. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dives into the hidden and often terrible truths of ancient civilizations. Because these stories matter. They matter as history. They matter as warning. They matter as testimony that some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how powerful the forces trying to bury them. Lilitu escaped the temple. She survived to bear witness. And thousands of years later, we're still listening to what she tried to tell the world. That's not nothing. That's everything.